How do we live a complex life, not a complicated one? That's what we're going to explore today in this deep dive. A life that is rooted in simplicity, but without making any unnecessary sacrifices. And one which is both peaceful and fulfilling without having to trade one for the other. One where we can maximize both depth and richness. One where we can be content with what we have and deeply okay with leaving out the rest. So what we're looking at is and, not or. How do we have both, not either one or the other? And what we're doing is we are using the book Deep Ecology for the 21st century for this lesson. But I am intentionally not going to be using examples that aren't just nature and environment based, just to show how this can be used on a larger scale. And just to be clear as well, this is the last book in a little mini 8-part series where we've considered our self-image in terms of our childhood, through to our adulthood, through to a study of peak experiences, all the way through to a transpersonal view of meaning and fulfillment, as well as shadow work and a lot more as well. So if you wanted to take the study of your self-image much further in terms of nature and the collective and the world around you, then this is an amazing book. It's just a little bit beyond the scope for this particular video. Oh, and a lot of these quotes are from essays and interviews with Arne Naess, who is a wonderful human being and philosopher from Norway, who I will gladly dedicate another video to in the future. Okay, so first rule to live by: simple in means and rich in ends. I'm going to kick this off with a powerful quote from Essay 3. And this will be quite an interesting one. Making it nice and clear on here. Technology is more helpless than ever before because the technology being produced doesn't fulfill basic human needs, such as meaningful work in a meaningful environment. Technical progress is sham progress because the term technical progress is a cultural, not a technical term. Our culture, is the only one in the history of mankind in which the culture has adjusted itself to the technology rather than vice versa. So rather than getting into big judgments here about how others live their lives, let's make that last point more relevant again, but on an individual basis. So I'm going to give you an example from my life where I've massively overcomplicated things to an unnecessary degree, and then you can see how this might apply to your life as well. So I'm currently building out my library to 500 books on psychology and philosophy, and I'm teaching the insights on the way. But I got frustrated quite a while back because of how long this was taking, because my process was reading the books and then highlighting the important sections, and then typing up some notes at the end of each chapter, and then moving it all over onto an Obsidian database, and then formatting and tagging every individual note and key quote from there. And every single book was just taking me so long to read, and I was forgetting practically everything I'd read because I was just jumping backwards and forwards between different jobs. So one day I slowed down, I looked at what I was doing, and I saw how in an ideal world this could be amazing, but that it just wasn't practical. My goal was to read more and to teach more, which is great, but in practice, I was obsessing more about the needlessly finer points of using various pieces of technology. I was getting bogged down in complicated means instead of focusing on the fulfilling ends. And a quote from page 36 summarizes my issue quite nicely, and it might reflect yours as well. Not that we need to limit our goals. I'm not for the simple life, except in the sense of a life simple in means, but rich in goals and values. That's where I got the name for this first part of the lesson. And that's what I had done. My goals, my ends, they were very rich and it was a meaningful one. But my way of getting there, my means, was anything but simple. And that was leading to a lot of the frustration. So widening the point and looking at your life, where are you trying to do something meaningful, but taking the overly complicated route? And where can you simplify the means of getting there? And this applies just as much as it does to our own lives and our careers and our friendships and our relationships and the plans for the future, just as much as it does our consideration for the environment. So it's a sort of whole life approach to minimalism rather than just reducing minimalism down to how much you own versus how much you're willing to remove from your home. And we've already looked at this book, Timeless Simplicity, in a recent video, and the same point applies here. This has to be a voluntary simplicity. It can't be forced. But when you take that path of voluntary simplicity, you realize actually it wasn't that difficult to begin with. It's just the first step towards simplicity, which is the difficult one. So next time you're getting frustrated with something or you're not able to achieve it, try looking at what it is that you're actually doing and think, how does simple in means and rich in ends apply here? So chances are you won't need more stuff to achieve the goal, but simply just a better way of going about it. So instead of just adjusting your life to more technology, how can you make technology usage work better for you? So to apply that to technology specifically. And a point like this obviously applies very, very widely. So let's just take this further and see how we can mine some of the depths to get to the gold underneath. And we're going to have a look at essay 19 to help with this. So we're jumping all the way ahead to page 209 for this next quote. Few people asked why or how with persistence, but those who did were deeply concerned with the ecological situation. The answers to these questions relate not only to chemistry and biology, they involved increasingly more and more of various aspects of human affairs. Economic, technological, social, cultural, and ultimately philosophical and religious aspects. This is the key part. That is, those who went deeper both questioned deeper in the sense of deeper premises and suggested deeper changes socially in a wider sense. Now, you can apply this in a very, very simple way. So ask yourself a question and get an answer, and then ask why multiple times, and you'll eventually get to a deeper and more fundamental answer that underlies the entire thing. So sometimes you can ask why 3 times, sometimes 5, sometimes 7, but just get to a point where the question or the answer seems substantially different than the original one. Your first answer will be relevant and useful, but in all likelihood, maybe quite superficial. But with each further inquiry, you'll go deeper and deeper into the foundations that the answer is really built on, and that's the gold that we want. It connects to the deeper why behind the question, which was there all along, but it was just hidden. So I won't go into massive detail here with examples, but you might find that just within a few minutes, you'll go from, I want to change my career, to asking why 5 times and realizing that actually the real answer is, underlying all of this, I've got no freedom, I want to be more creative, but I'm scared of stepping into the unknown. So that comes by asking why 5 separate times, and then we get to this deeper layer. Or to make it more specifically relevant to the theme of nature and the environment, given that's what the book's about, let's say you might say something like, I'm not sure if I should bother recycling because it doesn't seem to be having much of an impact. To realising that underneath it all, let's say you ask the question why to your answers repeatedly 7 times, you might realise 7 whys later that you're taking on the burden of everyone's problems around the world in all areas, and then getting frustrated that you can't solve all of humanity's problems by yourself. So there might be a noble cause there, but it's worth inquiring about the underlying motivation and assumption and how possible it is to manage. So you've just got to come up with a question, come up with an answer, ask why, and then repeatedly ask why on each further subsequent question and answer that you're asking yourself. And this links to a book that I mentioned a while back called Philosophy as a Way of Life. And the idea is that it's not enough to just intellectually grasp an idea. There needs to be an associated action or change in behaviour to make it a way of life, not just a way of thought. So we need to make sure this actually is intellectual and put into practice. So as well as thinking about how you can live more simply in terms of means, this might be the type of habit where you can actually start to clarify those rich ends that they point towards as well. So we've already got 2 super easy, high impact, very minimalist habits already. So to consider the rich, meaningful ends in advance by asking why multiple times to get to the foundations and to the heart of the issue, and to consider a way to get there which is in line with simplicity rather than unnecessary complexity. And you can already live a more peaceful and fulfilling life just by considering those two things. But while we're here, let's take it a little bit further. And we're going to go to page 61 for our next part of this. So again, as always, I will put the quote up on the screen just to make it all nice and clear. And we're going to be referring to this section just down here. If we are truly to reconnect with the land, we need to change our perceptions and approach more than our location. As long as we limit ourselves to narrow rationality and its limited sense of practicality, we will be disconnected from the deep ecology of our place. As Heidegger explains, dwelling is not primarily inhabiting, but taking care of and creating that space within which something comes into its own and flourishes. It takes both time and ritual for real dwelling. Now, I've already discussed the idea of creating a garden to dwell in on a deep dive on technology usage. So for this, I want to focus on that first sentence instead. If we want to connect with our lives and what is truly important to us, not just the land and nature, we need to approach it with a better appreciation of what is going on. So just like the land is more than the location where you are, your life is more than just the things that you do. And it can be useful to think about this in terms of Gestalts. So a Gestalt is something which is a whole in itself, but is also more than just a sum of its parts. So for example, the forest isn't just a series of trees. It's also a very delicate, interconnected balance of all the ecosystems from all the different plants. Let me just put up all these pictures on here as well. So we've got all the plants to all the different insects, to all the different flowers, and to the animals, and also to the human societies as well that pass through these. So this could be the people that live around the forest, to the hikers that are passing through, all the way through to the mushrooms under the soil and so on. So a forest is an incredibly and infinitely fascinating thing to pay attention to, because there's layers and layers of wonder depending on where you place the focus. And when you combine all of this together, new qualities emerge that can't be found in any individual part or fragment. It reveals itself through the larger Gestalt. And your individual life is no different. So that's also made up of Gestalts, but we typically just take them for granted. So from your relationship to others, to how you fit in with wider society, to your values, to your habits, to how you spend your money, to how you live, and so on, you can learn an incredibly large amount of information about yourself by not actually looking at yourself at all, and instead looking at your life around you and then seeing what this reveals about you. And this is where rituals start to come in, because they help you to step outside of your usual spaces that you occupy and allow you to look at what you're doing with a fresh perspective. Let me just make sure that hot air balloon is actually in frame. I think it is. So it sets up this liminal space where you're not quite here, but you're not quite there either. So let's say you decide to start camping and start a fire and reflect on your life. In that moment, you're not at work, you're not at home, and you're not in your usual surroundings. You've temporarily stepped outside of it all, which gives you this great opportunity to look in as an observer. In this case, you've changed the location, which has allowed you to change your perception. And now that you've experienced what it is like, you're able to tune into that altered perception much easier next time without having to change your location. So that way, even when it's not practical to step away from your life, it becomes possible to still connect with this deeper meaning behind it all. So, key question here for you. What are the rituals and practices that you can set up to help you temporarily step away from day-to-day life, to give yourself that fresh perspective? How can you dwell in these places long enough to have them change you rather than just passing through? And that might be finishing this lesson and thinking about how some of these points actually could be made practical in your life rather than just rushing on to another video. just say it. All right, last point. A few videos back, we taught a lesson on the 14 being values of Abraham Maslow. And we looked at some of the individual motivations and attitudes to take as you build your life around these values. And one of those values was simplicity, which again links back to that book that I mentioned before by John Lane. Now, essay 26 in this collection follows on in a similar way, and I'm going to leave a link below so you can see the full list of 25 attitudes that is suggested in this book. And again, I've tried to focus here on ones that aren't strictly about ecology and the environment so that they can apply more widely, but some of my personal favourites I'm going to put up on the screen just to make it all nice and clear. So first of all, the use of simple means and the avoidance of unnecessarily complicated means to reach a goal or an end. So we've already talked about that in part 1 of this lesson. The number 2, the propensity to prefer activities most directly serving values in themselves and having intrinsic value. So in other words, I personally value creativity and wisdom. So I'm going to choose to live a life in accordance with these values without being precious about exactly how I'm being creative or wise. And again, it links back to part 1 of this lesson and part 2. If you keep drilling down, then the idea is that you can actually figure out what these values are in yourself. So again, that's just an idea about what I mean there when I say propensity to prefer activities most directly serving values in themselves and having intrinsic value. If you ask why 5, 6, 7 times, you're going to get to a deeper answer than just the superficial one to begin with. I'm going to combine points 5, 10, and 11 together for the sake of this. So point 5, absence or low degree of novophilia. So the love of what is new merely because it's new, and cherishing old and well-worn things. Number 10, to go for depth and richness of experience rather than intensity. And number 11, to appreciate and choose, whenever possible, meaningful work rather than make a living. So all of this just adds even more depth to that phrasing, like I was saying before, of simple in means and rich in ends. And also, number 18, why we're here as well. So the tendency to appreciate all life forms rather than merely those considered to be beautiful, remarkable, or narrowly useful. So this takes the idea of Gestalts just a little bit further. So rather than seeing, for example, like a flower or a frog or a fox as only instrumentally useful, it's instead learning to appreciate them as intrinsically valuable. They don't just need a human-based usefulness and to treat them as objects, but we can actually appreciate the interiors and the depths and the right to live. There's even more links here to other books and lessons, especially integral theory, where we looked at the insides and the outsides of individuals and collectives to realize that we need to see all 4 aspects as valuable. And for those wondering as well, I do intentionally try to live as simple and sustainable life as possible. And that includes quite a lot of things, just a few things off the top of my head. We've got the idea that I very rarely buy clothing anyway, but whenever I do, it is secondhand. Practically all of these books that I'm reading, they're all secondhand, mainly from charity shops as well. I essentially spend all of my time drinking coffee and reading books and talking to people about those books and working one-on-one with people in a mentoring capacity to help them make use of all this material. So again, that's a very sustainable practice in itself. In terms of holidays, I very rarely fly, maybe taking 1 or 2 per year. I don't drive, and although I'm not anymore, I was a fairly strict vegetarian for 15 years. So I personally don't feel like I'm missing out on anything vital because, again, where's that book gone? I've intentionally stripped back the unnecessary parts of my life and I've streamlined my life to be in line with my values, which I've consciously refined. So I know it's going to lead to fulfillment. Again, that relies on this being voluntary simplicity, not an enforced simplicity. But anyway, I'd recommend looking at that full list of 25 guidelines and attitudes of living a more sustainable life and just pick out the ones that stand out to you and create your own version that you've got so that you've got it to hand as well. And the point is that you've intentionally created a minimum skeleton, an outline for a meaningful life, which is rooted in minimalism. It's rooted in this minimalistic approach instead of being needlessly complicated. So then you can have more freedom to choose what you want to actually do in your otherwise daily life. I did a very similar thing with the smack recipe video in my classroom specifically. So if you want even more ideas, by all means have a nosy at that lesson. But we've covered quite a lot there, and I just want to be able to summarize it all down. So if you wanted to start practicing a more simple, peaceful, intentional, and fulfilling minimalist life, then I'd start looking up the work of Arne Naess and this book more widely as well. So just for example, those ideas, we've got the idea of simple in means and rich in ends. We had this idea of the deepness of questions, which I simplified down to the 7 whys. We had this idea around the 25 attitudes, which are, again, are all directly related to his work. And he discusses the importance as well of the Gestalts in terms of his other work. But that one specifically, that essay, was to do with Dolores, I think it's pronounced La Chapelle? Sorry, I was just trying to find all these 4 pictures. I feel like this summarizes it down quite nicely. So there's so many more amazing thoughts and ideas in these essays, but I am going to leave it here for now. I'll return to this topic at a later date, but I'm just going to end with a really, really short quote all the way through on page 464, because I feel like it just summarizes this very, very nicely. So in short, there is no time for overly pessimistic statements that can be exploited by pacifists and those who promote complacency. And I think that applies on the individual level as well. So, for example, don't just go along with the overly pessimistic parts of your personality all the time just because they're perhaps the loudest ones. Pay attention to them, but again, keep these 4 habits in mind as well at the same time. And instead of waiting for meaning and fulfillment to come to you, maybe it's more worthwhile to create a life where they'll be pulled to you instead. All right, we've covered quite a lot there, so I'm going to leave it there for now, and I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.